One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the Scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? They went into the house of God, and they broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. Also, he gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath." Maybe you've heard somebody talk about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. You know, the letter of the law is how a law or rule is written, and the spirit of the law is the intent behind why that rule or that law is written. We as people oftentimes get dogmatic when it comes to how things are done, and we ignore why things are done. These verses are a great example of that. Now, I recognize and I acknowledge that there are things that are very black and white. There are some things that are wrong, and there's some things that are right. But there's also gray areas. And this is an area that we as Christians get just consumed with. The law that Jesus is violating exists not for God's sake, but for man's sake. Specifically, Jesus is violating the Sabbath day of rest. And part of the purpose of the Sabbath is to prioritize the value of rest, knowing what our limitations are, and surrendering to God. These Pharisees see Jesus and his disciples behaving in a way that they feel like is violating the law, the letter of the law. And they may be correct, except Jesus throws a doozy at them. Not only do they miss the point of the Sabbath, but they are also talking to the Son of Man, who is the Lord over the law and the Sabbath. That is a biblical mic drop. That is Jesus saying, you can't use the law against me because I am above the law. These verses end with, so the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. We tend to get wrapped up in the semantics of things without truly understanding Jesus, in his entering of humanity, fulfills the law, which then forces us to ask the question, what is the point of the law? Is the law there to give us direction and create freedom, or confusion and oppression? And Jesus begins to talk about what it looks like to live under Christ's law, a law that should open us up for more and not for less. So join us this week as we explore these verses.
Well, if you like what you're experiencing with Waypoints Go, then we just ask that you would hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and then maybe share it with a couple of friends to continue this conversation.
Today we're going to see another opportunity where Jesus gets in conflict with the Pharisees. Jesus really is under persecution from the Pharisees pretty much his entire ministry, his entire 3 years. The religious people are keeping their eye on Jesus, and that's because Jesus is always violating their rules. Now, make sure that you hear that. He's not violating God's laws, he's violating the religious rules, and today they're going to get after him for working on the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath is an important topic. It's important to God. God puts it in what we refer to as the Ten Commandments. God himself takes a Sabbath and a rest He tells you and I in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, he says, remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. That the Sabbath is supposed to be some day that you and I take a rest, that we kind of switch gears, that we change what we're doing, or we focus on God a little bit more. And that's great. That's awesome. We're supposed to pause from work. The natural question then is, okay, so what is work? What is rest? At what point am I doing something that's all of a sudden now considered to be work, or it's considered to be rest? And these are great, great questions, because we as humans, we don't really handle vagueness very well. We want to know where the line is. We don't handle shades of gray too well. Where is the line? And if we're really honest as followers of Jesus, we want to know, how much can I do without crossing the line into sin? And that's one of the things that we always struggle with when God gives us something so vague as, you should take a day of rest. Well, what does that look like? Now, we also need to remember that the Pharisees, the reason why they existed and what they're doing, the Pharisees believed in holiness. In fact, the Pharisees believed that the only reason why God allowed the Romans to overtake them and to rule them was because they as a nation, as a people group, they're just not holy enough. So the Pharisees believed that if they could raise the holiness level of the Jewish people, that God would free them from the Romans, that he would set them free, life could go back to normal. So they took it upon themselves to be the moral police, to help people to know what is right and wrong and what is holy and unholy, and they took it upon themselves to be able to draw that line. And so when it comes to the Sabbath, they had to tell people what was work and what was rest. And so they determined 39 categories, not 39 rules, but 39 categories of do's and don'ts on the Sabbath that would help people to know what is work and what is rest. So one day, Jesus and his disciples, they're walking somewhere outside of Jerusalem, and they begin walking alongside a field of grain. And the disciples, they're hungry. The people with Jesus, they're hungry. And so they would reach down and they would grab the stalk, the head, and they would rub the grain, separating the grain from the chaff, and they would blow the chaff away, and then they would take the grain and they'd pop it in their mouth and they would eat it. They were hungry. Now we need to understand they're not violating any sort of laws here. In fact, God has a law that we find in Deuteronomy that says people who are passing the field, if they are hungry, that they can go and they can grab some grain and blow away the chaff and eat it. What they can't do is collect it and save it for later, because, well, that would be stealing from somebody, right? But God says if you're hungry, you can come alongside and you can grab that. So the Pharisees see Jesus and the disciples doing this, and they're not angry that Jesus and his disciples are eating from the field, because that goes with the law. What they're angry about is it's on the Sabbath. And grabbing that grain and separating the grain from the chaff and blowing the chaff away, well, that's considered harvesting, and that's considered work. So here's the thing with religious people, you just can't win. For the religious people, they have their rules. See, the Pharisees thought, well, Jesus and his disciples, if they wanted to eat from this field, they should have gathered all their stuff yesterday. But if they had gathered their stuff yesterday and saved it, then that would have been violating a different law. You just can't win with religious people. And so Jesus counteracts. He speaks back to them, corrects them by telling a story about David. David is revered throughout the Jewish culture, and the Pharisees respected him deeply. I mean, David is a man after God's own heart. And so Jesus begins to tell a story that we find in 1 Samuel, where David is on the run for his life from Saul. And David has to get some food in the midst of all of that. Now, for you and I to really understand the point of what Jesus is going to get to, we really need to understand the Jewish culture and what's happening in this time. So the temple that the Jewish people would worship in is actually the tabernacle at this moment. It's a tent. And so at the time of David, what would happen is every Sabbath, people would bake this bread and they would put it in the tabernacle. Now it's called the bread of the presence or show bread. And there would be 12 loaves of bread. And these 12 loaves represented the 12 tribes of Israel. They represented who they were. And the only people who were allowed to eat this bread were the priests who were serving in the tabernacle. That's who it was. And so as the story continues, David's on the run for his life, and he is able to eat this food, this bread that is prepared inside for the tabernacle, for the priests, and God doesn't reprimand David. He doesn't say that it's a sin. He doesn't say that there's anything wrong with it, because David is hungry, and God is way more concerned about his hunger and their survival than he is any sort of religious rules. See, for God created the Sabbath. He created the Sabbath so that you and I could get rest, so that you and I could just let go of the burdens of life. And Jesus is telling them that these Pharisees, that they're making a relationship with God a burden instead of the rest in which God intended it. See, God did not create man for the Sabbath. He created the Sabbath for man. The word for Sabbath in Hebrew is Shabbat. And Shabbat literally means to trust, to put down, to make rest, or as one dictionary says, to catch one's breath. Jesus is like, that's what we're supposed to happen. That's what the Sabbath is all about. It actually points to other words that Jesus says, if you pick up my yoke, it is light and easy, and I will give you rest. See, God is a huge fan of rest, and our relationship with God is supposed to bring us that peace, supposed to bring us that rest. It's not supposed to be relationship's not supposed to be filled with a burden. And the Pharisees would argue that the disciples were breaking rules, and those rules are a burden. And when it comes to our faith, when we burden people with rules, when we burden people with, you've got to do this in order to be right with God, then we make our relationship with God a burden instead of a rest. God was always about helping people, not about giving them more and more burdens. And so Jesus gets really frustrated with the Pharisees, because our relationship with God, we shouldn't hinder people. We shouldn't give them all these rules, because God is a God of rest. Welcome to WaypointsGO. We are a crowd-funded channel creating digital content for the gospel on the move. If you like what you see, check out in the description a link to partner with us.
You know, rules are good at one thing. That one thing is really to keep everything in an order. And rules only do that one thing when they're followed, honestly, 100% of the time. Rules, when bent or a little fudged or applied unevenly, they don't really work that well. Because then you have rules for some and then not for others, and that just doesn't work out. See, rules only bring about change when they're followed to the letter 100% of the time, but that's really the problem with rules. We as people don't respond to rules well, do we? We don't when they're given to us, we want to know the details behind the rules. We want to know the intention behind them, the reason, who came up with this, why does this rule exist, what happened to give us this rule, and we want to know every exception to the rule. Then we know if we want to commit ourselves to that rule. I know I'm not alone when I say that, but we're always kind of looking for this way to kind of cut the corners or live our own life. It's just human nature, and that's honestly, that's what we all do. But sometimes we find ourselves in situations when we want to follow the rule out of an obligation. See, obligation takes time, and honestly, it drains us of any energy that we had to want to follow the rule. Because we want to be better people. We want to live at a higher standard. But if we're living to that higher standard out of some sort of obligation, that's kind of tiring. It gets old. No amount of incentive for us is going to make us follow that rule. See, rules are good, but rules can bring with a certain amount of shame and guilt that drains our life when we want to try and follow this. If we miss the mark, then we're just left with the feeling that we don't have what it takes to live up to that standard. There must be something wrong with us, and we must be broken. Now, spiritually speaking, that's where Jesus comes in, and he knows that this is the only way. Religion is looking at the scorecard and the decisions that you and I make, and they're basing our success on how much points we have. Do we have enough points on the scoreboard to be considered successful? And that's not very motivating at all when you're always under the scope and always being judged by how well we kept it. See, we see words like this from Jesus, and that brings us back to the original meaning of what Jesus is trying to bring back to the rule. But we tend to place ourselves under rules so that we can keep track of where we're at. We might ask for that rule to be placed on us so we know what standard we're living up against. And the rule is actually made to bring fulfillment in us. Our relationship to these rules are found in our faith that's dependent on who's in charge. See, if we're in charge, we're looking for 100% compliance. And that only brings frustration, discouragement, shame, and guilt. But if Jesus is in charge, then rules are there to bring about life change, about motivation. Because it's not based on how well we and you and I or anybody can keep these rules. It's based on what kind of life Jesus is calling me to. What standard is he setting? Not what standard am I setting. Religion doesn't bring life. Relationships do. That's the way Jesus is flipping the system on its head. It's not about compliance, it's about connection. It's about a connection to Jesus, and that gives us this grace and this willingness to keep living just like him. In our lives, we can either enforce rules or we can build relationships. Those are honestly two options I see here. Think of all the people that you have connection with. Just think of everybody that you have a relationship with. Your coworkers or your spouse or your students or your partner or your family or your kids or your neighbors. Every single one of those connections that you have an influence over. Just by being you. Just the conversations that you have and your interests and your passions. And then when those interests and passions that you hold are mixed in a conversation with that other individual's interests and passions, there's an influence that seems to happen. How well do you think you would be able to change any one of those connections for the positive through enforcing any rules on that person? Probably not, because that's not how humans respond. We don't like that. Now, does it change the circumstance or does it change the relationship? to bring about this positive change that you're looking for, when all of a sudden you're just simply there to build a relationship and give that person just what they need in that moment, regardless of what norms or what rules might need to be applied at that moment? Do you think seeing the heart of the individual might actually create more change in that person's life than giving them a rule to follow? It's just a thought. See, relationships have to come first. But enough of what I think. What do you think? Let's talk about that.